Thank you very much, our Master of Ceremony, and thank you for your introductory remarks. You have asked me to speak or make a few remarks so that we can, I'm sure everybody is anxious to ask some questions, particularly to President Mahama, who really epitomizes Africa's best. And he has given us an example of West Africa, but which also, in a way, reflects the entire continent. If you have followed the story of Ghana, that is the story of Africa. And by the way, as he said, well, Ghana is still in West Africa. I should also say, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent. Now, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all acknowledge the presence of many ministers here and distinguished participants that have come to join us in this, and also to thank the co-organizers of this event for this very timely event. Timely because we are addressing one of Africa's key issues, and that is closing Africa's transformation financing gap. And before I address that particular aspect in a very succinct manner, let me just highlight some 4 points. The first point is Africa is growing. The question is, where is this growth coming from? Let me suggest there are 4 major growth areas for Africa. The first is that if you look at Africa's trajectory, in the last 10 years, 15 years, 4 significant developments have taken place. The first one is macroeconomic stability or prudence. A few ministers of finance will be here and they will be testifying to that. And this has provided Africa's growth. The second one, peace dividend. In the last 10 years, in spite of the fact that the world continues to highlight a few cases, a few setbacks, Africa is benefiting from peace dividends. More than 90% of Africans now live in what you would call peaceful area. The third point is the demand for Africa's resources in the last 10 years has been huge. And finally, Africa has also diversified its market and partnerships. Having said this, although Africa's growth has been good, averaging 5 to 10% in some countries, there are some worrying signals. The first signal is that we still have very high unemployment, we still have very high poverty, and particularly among the youth, the unemployment is worrying. And that is why our leaders, the African heads of state and government, in the last few years, have decided to tackle this head-on. And one of the instruments I've put in place at the continental level is to develop what we call Agenda 2063. Globally, this is what you might call the post-2015 development agenda. It is our hope that when this post-2015 development agenda is negotiated, it will mirror that which we have done in Africa, because this again will give us synergy globally and Africa-wise for us to be able to address the key issues that confront the continent. And what are these issues? And that's point number 2. The first is poverty that is high in the continent, and we feel there are instruments on the ground that can tackle this poverty. The second one, skills revolution, including science and technology and innovation. We need massive investment in this particular area. The third is transformation of the African economy, particularly focusing on beneficiation. If you look at Africa's exports, they are largely really raw materials. And if you look at some of the statistics that are worrying, look at cocoa, coffee, and the rest. Just to give you some figures, which were highlighted just recently when we had this summit here in Washington. The coffee industry value in the global market is about 100 billion. Africa gets less than 10 billion of that. and yet Africa produces that coffee. And that is part of what we would like to see in terms of beneficiation, that we would have Africa export cocoa or coffee or whatever it is in final products. The fourth area that is extremely important for investment is agriculture and agribusiness. It's no again saying that if you look at the future of the world economy, Africa has to be the basket. If Africa doesn't step up, then actually globally, this is not for the benefit of Africa, it's the benefit of humankind. Africa has to be the basket for food production come 2050. And the fifth area is interconnection of the continent. At the moment, the continent is virtually virgin. Connectivity, the old system that was there was not meant to really have Africa connect with Africa. And President Mahama has just given a few examples of some of the projects, pipeline, railway, whatever it is, ICT. These are key for the continent. The fifth one is, of course, trade within the continent, which is very low at the moment, averaging about 12%, but where Africa has the future if Africa is going to use its population dividend to be able to transform its economy. And the seventh one is youth as its driver's renaissance. Again, this is all in the public domain, and you know much about it, that Africa is the youngest continent in the world, and the continent for that matter for the future. But we also stand a risk if we don't take advantage of the youth by giving them skills, giving them employment. Associated with this is also the issue of gender, which is an area of concern for Africa, because if you look particularly at women folk, not many of them are in the mainstay of the economy. And yet if you look at some of the agriculture sectors like agriculture, they contribute the most. And finally, what President Mahama has talked about, mobility, which is in West Africa and which we would like to see throughout the continent. The final one, and which will bring me to the third point, is, well, no, before that, is also expanding the democratic and the people's democratic space and the people-centered, governance. And the 12th one, I'm just giving the key programs for the continent, is domestic resource mobilization. And that brings me to the third point, which is really to look at what is Africa's financing gap like? It goes into billions, and no one can give you a precise figure, but we can give you some indications by some of the sectors. Just to indicate, we have in Africa developed a number of flagship programs. One such program is in the area of infrastructure, which is called Program for Infrastructure Development, which runs into billions. At the moment, the docket of a number of projects we have run into over 350 billion. We have a program on agriculture, again, very well detailed, which goes into action at national level, regional level, at continental level. It also runs into billions. We have a program on Pan-African University. I talked about skills development. Whereas Africa, we want to really have skills revolution by training lots of, at the moment, if you look at the people we are sending to the market, annually, we are sending about 7 million youth in the market. But if you look at their skills, they are not quite employable. And so we need to interrogate that aspect so that we can improve on skills. And the fifth one is on the continental free trade area that I mentioned. In fact, we are keeping our eyes on 2017 as a date that we should start to see the implementation of the continental free trade area. And finally, the peace and security architecture. What President Mahama said here clearly illustrates that we have two sides to the coin. If you are going to have peace, development, you must have peace. And without peace, you can't have development. Without development, you can't have peace. The two are critical for the continent. And the good thing about the continent, again, epitomized by what my president has just said here. The African leaders have taken the ownership, the leadership, and action to try and make sure that the continent is at peace with itself and also contribute to global peace. Now, and that brings me to the last point, which is, of course, resource mobilization for the continent. As I indicated earlier, if you look at the needs, let's take one example. The World Bank has given us an estimate that in the area of climate change, in mitigation and adaptation alone, Africa will need close to 1 trillion. Africa will need close to 1 trillion. Well, that is not sunk investment. In fact, the studies show that with that kind of investment, and that is annually, in the coming years, Africa will be the driver of global economy. And so this is a huge, huge need, but also a huge investment opportunity. Now, where will these resources come from? One can go on and indicate in all these sectors that I've indicated. First, as my good brother Erastus was saying, as I was walking in, Africa is now looking at how we can mobilize internal resources. One of the areas we're looking at, first of all, is the sovereign funds. The second one is we're looking at private equity funds and bonds, but we're also looking at how we can stop leakages that Africa is experiencing by way of improving on tax collection and also illicit transfer of funds from the continent. And finally, we're also looking at areas of taxation. But of course, all this will be Africa's effort. We hope that, and as the President has indicated, Africa is still open to investment. What we're seeing, particularly investment from the US and Europe, the pace is not as high as we would like to see. And we leave this to you to tell us what's happening. But we see, for instance, Asia, the pace is picking up. And so we would like, as we engage each other, to see how can we step this up, because the climate is conducive for sure. You can see we're addressing issues of peace. We are trying to address the issue of competitiveness, and also the returns in Africa are good. The question is, why are you not writing your checks? And I think after this, we should hope to see that we get a way forward to see more investment into Africa, because that's where the return is, and that's where the future is. I thank you very much.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.